Hello and welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to dive into an oil pastel beginner tutorial. This will be a step-by-step tutorial using a limited palette. So pretty much any oil pastel kit that you get, you're going to be able to find similar colors and use them for this tutorial. Now I have the reference image up in the corner and I will have it linked in the description if you'd like to see it in like a larger format. But what I like to do with really anything that I'm drawing is start with at least a slight outline. It doesn't have to be super detailed, but just give me a direction, help me to kind of map things out and see how big things are going to be. And it gives me the ability to focus on applying colors and getting the relationships correctly without having to worry about size. If you need help with the drawing process and just would like to have a little bit more confidence with this, I will link my mini drawing course down below. It's totally free and it will help you really jumpstart and quickly improve in your drawing process. But if you're just ready to get into the oil pastels, stay with me. We're going to get started. We're going to start by establishing our base. The wonderful thing about radishes is that they're red and we have a red. So we're going to start by just kind of outlining everything and laying down a base red tone. Now you'll notice that I'm not pressing very hard. As you can see, there's like a lot of paper showing through, so we're just doing this lightly. We'll be applying more colors over top of it in order to get some of the shaping in there and just establish some of the underlying hues, but we're just kind of getting some of that color on there. I'm also going through and I am pressing a little bit harder on areas where kind of the core of the shadows are, where there's not reflected light, kind of where you can see the arrows pointing at, where I'm just kind of establishing where some of these deeper colors are. For areas that are quite a bit deeper or that are falling more into the background, and I'm adding a little bit of this deeper blue. See, called ultramarine blue. Still keeping it very light. We will be blending these together. We will be pushing harder later, but at this point we're just trying to establish that base. It's kind of like the first pass in a painting or in a watercolor. Then I'm going to use my finger, and I am wearing gloves here. You do not have to. I'm often interrupted by my kids and I want to be able to, have clean hands right away, so I do use gloves, but you do not need to, and I don't always. But I'm just using my fingers to kind of blend these colors in together. And again, the purpose of that is to establish the base, and we'll be following this pattern throughout the rest of this tutorial. Now we can go in with other colors. This color is a magenta, but it is called purple, and so that's what I will call it for this tutorial. But I'm going in, I'm establishing, or I'm applying that where I'm seeing there are some cooler undertones. We'll also be adding in some more of the blue and with shadows, but I found that really the purple adding the purple in helped to establish the correct value and just kind of picked up some of those more interesting undertones. I added a little bit of white just again to kind of establish that highlight, and I'm going in with our ultramarine blue in some of these areas that are just going to be in a deeper shadow. So I'm trying to just kind of go slowly, mark out the shape, and then I'm using the red over top of it again. And now is when I'm starting to press with more aggression so that I'm kind of blending together with the oil pastels. You can see I'm using more of a circular motion, and that is allowing the two colors to blend together, giving me more of a nice, deep, cool tone shadow. And I'm just going to repeat the process until I've started to build up the value that I want. You can also do this with the green tones or even the brown, but I just really like using the cooler tones like this blue for my shadows. So again, slowly establishing some of the shadows, adding a little bit more, taking our red, and again, and see how I'm using those circular motions. That will help really press the oil pastel together so that they're blending together, pushing into the paper, and you're able to get a nice blend. To blend it a little bit further, you can also use your fingers. Then I'm going to take some of the magenta, and again, I'm going into some of the highlights. There's a lot of reflected light from the lighter table here, but it's not really quite enough to need a white. And so having the cooler, I said magenta, didn't I? Having the purple tone in here really helps a lot. And while I'm still using the oil pastels primarily to blend, I tend to go back with my fingers. It's because these oil pastels are a little bit more firm, not quite as soft. It is a little bit more challenging to blend with your fingers, and that's why I do depend on the oil pastels a little bit more. So we're going to continue adding layers in here, so you can see that the highlight I had almost disappeared, and so we'll just add that in a little bit more. At least when I work with oil pastels, it tends to be a lot of layers and kind of continuing to build things up. Now for our radishes in the background, we definitely need to have them recede a little bit. So visually, I want to push it back by cooling it down and making it a little bit darker. I like to use the same shadows throughout as much as possible, and so we're going to be layering a ton of this ultramarine blue and then applying the red on top of it, blending that in order to kind of get this much deeper, moodier color back here. And even though this radish will have less layering, it's less complicated than the one in front of it because I want the one in front of it to have more focus, we're still going to have to go back and forth a little bit, build up the values, build up those shadows, and kind of establish a shape so that it still looks like a radish and looks three-dimensional. And we shall repeat this process with the other radishes that are a little bit more in the back. You've probably already noticed, but I did leave off the radish that is the farthest to the right hand side and decided to just stick with the 5. And we're going to repeat this for all of our radishes. So we've got our base red color. I had a little bit of the purple / magenta in for some of the reflected colors, but then I want to add in these shadows. So I'm looking at my reference image, I'm trying to break it down, just kind of trace out where those shadows would be, not getting into a lot of detail yet. We're starting really basic, just kind of blocking out some of these colors, and then some of the details we'll add in later. Then I'm using our base color again to kind of blend everything together, helps to blend that blue color in, also helps everything to have kind of a nice smooth gradient. One nice thing about these oil pastels, I don't often find that I feel like I need to kind of clean them off, but if you do feel like they're just, the color's starting to blend out too much or just get kind of messy, go ahead and grab either a bath tissue, some paper towel, something that you can just kind of quickly wipe off any excess on. For the tail or the root, whatever you want to call it, of our radishes, I found that kind of a combo of yellow ochre and white worked really well. So the yellow ochre was pretty accurate, but there were times where at the very tip especially I needed to lighten it. So I would layer white over the top of it. Again, these oil pastels, because they're a little bit more firm, I found that I could really get some of these nice tight details in there. So I really liked that about these oil pastels. Well, generally speaking, Sennelier has my heart. That was really nice about this. Now, kind of glancing back, I felt like I needed a little bit of this yellow here, just right at the top to warm it up a little bit. Looking back at the reference photo and kind of the finished piece, I don't think I necessarily needed this, but it made me feel better for some reason. So if you want to add this, go ahead and add it. If you feel like maybe the purple would work, I think that it would fulfill kind of the same purpose. Feel free to do that. At the risk of boring you, I'm going to talk about doing the same exact process with our final radish. Now this one was in a little bit more shadow, so I had to go back and forth a little bit more with our ultramarine blue, a little bit less with our purple color, not at all with the yellow, and just building up some of those shadows. Of course, adding in our root and our highlights in there, but it was generally the same process. Now for the leaves, I had more trouble with the leaves. Not gonna lie, I struggle with the bright colors that come with the palette, so I wanted to knock it back immediately by adding in the yellow ochre. So I'm just lightly applying this all over the place. This yellow tone that's a little bit more desaturated, a little bit more muted, is going to automatically help to knock down the saturation so it just won't be so bright, quite so Crayola crayon colored, which is what I was trying to avoid with this piece. I didn't want it to kind of jump at you or be too loud. So establishing this base color should help with that. Then we're going to go in with our yellow green. So this is a very bright, rather light yellow. And in hindsight, I should have added more of the yellow ochre. I was feeling a little bit timid for some reason, and I should have been a little bit more gutsy. I needed more of a base here, more of that desaturated tone. I had to work kind of by layering on top of it in order to knock it back and mute it up a little bit. I'm also going to add some ultramarine in here, again, to kind of tone everything down, get those shadows in there. And I like to keep it fairly consistent throughout my pieces. So if there's a color I've been using for a shadow, I tend to stick with it for a while, or at least try to use it as much across the board as I can. Again, I kind of struggle with these brighter greens, so I tend to dip into both of them, and because they're both rather cool toned, I will mix it into the blue areas just to kind of get the right movement in here, but still blending in with the colors on top. Well, I do like to blend with my fingers for oil pastels a lot. With these firmer oil pastels, it's easier to do it with the oil pastels themselves and just allow the creaminess and the pressure to bring everything together. But green and red are opposites on the color wheel, so there were areas that I felt like just needed to be pushed back, especially this dark area right above this radish and kind of hiding in there where I have the arrow on a reference image. And so I added a little bit more red in there, again, just to kind of knock it back, to desaturate it a little bit, and I think that that worked out pretty well. Now, unfortunately, some of the leaves are a little bit harder to see just because of how I had the camera angled, but I think that this will help break it down for you. So as I mentioned earlier, I became quickly aware that I needed a little bit more of the yellow ochre. And by a little bit more, I mean a ton more. And I was layering that underneath the yellow green primarily. I would then go in with the cooler tone green, emerald green, and I would layer that into areas that had a little bit more shadow, just to kind of, again, establish some of those values and figure out how things are turning and shaping. Then I would layer again with our yellow green. Again, I found that using the oil pastels to blend was the most successful for this, and just having the colors underneath it, sometimes I'd have to go back and I'd add a little bit more, and sometimes I need to go in with a different color entirely. Basically, my rule of thumb was if it was too bright, then I would go in with the yellow ochre. If it needed a shadow, then I'd grab either the blue, the cool tone emerald green, or areas that were also still desaturated, I would pull in the brown as well. Then I would either use my finger or the light green and blend everything together. So sometimes the finger was a little bit more helpful, and other times it was easier to blend with the oil pastels themselves. Then to finish everything off, I would add white to the highlights. This really helped to capture some of the glossiness and texture of the leaves, and I ended up using more and more of this as I went on. White also will desaturate, and so it worked out really well to kind of finish off with the white in my highlights. Now, if you're really enjoying the leaves and you're finding it to be a simple process, go ahead and keep going. I was not enjoying them, so I decided to start working on the background, and I actually chose kind of an unlikely combo, or at least one that I was not intending to. Now, I did choose the light gray as our main base, and that didn't surprise me so much as the colors that I used after this. So I'm going in with our light gray. It's a beautiful color. I highly recommend it for your base in this situation. I really enjoyed it. I felt like it allowed the radishes to really shine, but it still added a softness that was just really lovely. So I'm applying this kind of all over. We're not pressing super hard, and I am going around the bowl that I added in this piece that's not in our reference image, but I just kind of wanted to experiment with it anyway. And I'm just kind of laying down, again, the base color. And we're going to be adding a brown shadow to this. It ended up blending together beautifully. It took a little bit of work to get the two to blend together. We're really going to have to press hard with our oil pastels here, but this turned out so lovely together, which I was so happy about. As with all of our shadows, we're going to start slowly, and then we'll be building them up to get the intensity that we want. But basically what we're doing is we're just establishing where the shadows are going to go. And then, because I was worried about having the cool tone gray with the warm brown, I decided to take the yellow ochre and lightly apply it over the top of all of my gray. Now, I did this. I don't think you need to do this, but it worked out, and it was something that I wanted to do to kind of keep things a little bit more consistent. I didn't want the warmth of the leaves to be too disconnected from everything else, and so I took, instead of taking the green color, I decided to take the yellow ochre instead. And after there's a light layer of our yellow ochre over everything, we're going to add some white, and we're going to use the white to kind of blend things together. We're also going to use it primarily on our right hand side because we want to establish our highlight. There's a gradient of color, and so having our white to mix everything together will help to establish the lighter areas of that gradient, help to desaturate it a little bit more than just adding the yellow ochre is going to do, and just helps it to all blend together in the end. Now you can see I used my fingers after I had applied the oil pastels. I was able to blend it together pretty nicely with the oil pastel itself, but I felt like I needed a little bit more, especially because this is cold press watercolor paper, and so it has a little bit more of a texture. So there were areas that were left blank even if I was pressing with a little bit more pressure. And so I went through with my fingers and just started to blend everything together. By working lightest and then slowly moving to the darker areas, I was able to establish a little bit more of a gradient. And just pulling in some more gray if I felt like it was getting a little bit too warm, or pulling in a little bit more shadow if we started to lose that. And with areas that I wanted the color change to be a little bit softer, instead of going back in with the oil pastels, I would just use my finger. This was a little bit tricky because I wanted to avoid making any halos or transferring the red onto areas of the paper where I didn't necessarily want it. So you just have to go slowly and work carefully. Then once the background was done and I had established the shadows the way I wanted them to be, it was time to finish the leaves that I had been avoiding for so long. So I just continued with the same formula I had done before, where it was heavy on the yellow ochre, the light green was, or the yellow green was used to kind of blend everything together. But I was using the emerald green and the blues and mostly the brown at this point to kind of create some of those shadows. And the brown kind of helped pull in some of the background, and so that worked out really well. If I wanted to get it really rich and dark, especially areas by some of the stems and kind of defining those pieces, that's when I would pull in some of our red. Again, this not only helps to define the space by desaturating it and creating a shadow because it's the complement of green, red is the complement of green, but it helps to kind of mimic and repeat some of the colors that we see elsewhere in the radishes, the main focus of this piece. And so I do like pulling that in if I have an opportunity to do so. But I will not bore you by going through every single leaf. Let's talk about the background. I considered almost a repeat of our table, but I decided to go a little bit moodier and a little bit richer. We are starting with our lovely base of yellow ochre. It's just something that I love to do to help kind of establish some of that saturation. But once our yellow ochre layer was in place, it was time to go in with our deep, rich background. So I went in with the brown, very similar to like a burnt umber color, in order to establish a nice, moody background. Then I went in with ye old trusty fingers and blended everything together. Now, if you didn't want your background to be quite this deep and rich, going in with the gray as your blending color would be perfect. But I really wanted to have some of the drama, some of the moodiness, and so I stuck with the rich colors and just used my fingers to blend everything together. There were times where I needed a little bit more richness or the color started to become patchy, and so I just layered on more of the brown before continuing to blend out with my fingers. Once I had that whole base layer established, I went in with the gray over on the right hand side just to establish some of that gradient. I also pulled some of the brown color kind of down into the table. Again, it's a color that I used for the shadows, and so I'm trying to create a little bit more of a gradient, show the distance and the depth, and just soften that line. I have crisp lines around my radishes and I want those to be the focal point, but just to soften the background, I started to kind of blend where that line was. I love the drama of a gradient, so I definitely wanted to keep that in my background as well as on the table. And so I used my finger to continue to blend in the gray color, and I will be deepening the brown color on the left-hand side again. I decided to go through and kind of finish off my leaves by softening the edges. I could have gotten a really crisp edge here, and that's kind of how I started, by going around it with our brown color, our background color, but then I went through with my finger and I softened everything, and I softened it out and away from the leaves. I wanted there to be a good balance between things that are really crisp and edges that are soft. So I want my radishes, my focus, to be nice and crisp, but the background colors, leaves that fall more in the background, or just that are less of a focal point or less interesting, I allow the edges of those to be a little bit softer, a little bit less attention grabbing, and just automatically fall into the distance. Kind of think about it like if you're using portrait mode on your phone when you're taking a picture, how it blurs the background. That's what I'm trying to add intentionally to my painting to make it a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more interesting. Now we're going to add in the bowl, and I was a little nervous to add this in, so I waited till the very end, but we're just going to use the same colors we've been using for the background. Instead of adding yellow ochre this time, I'm going in with a base of just our light gray. I did add our brown to the shadows, but not too much because I want this to read kind of like a china bowl, and so I want it to be very high key overall, and I can always add more shadows in later. So I'm working on both the inside and the outside of the bowl, so you can see a little bit into the lip, and just slowly adding these colors together. And like we have been doing, we have our base color in there, we're adding our shadows in, kind of establishing other values or other colors, and then blending that in either with our initial base color or with our finger. So again, we're working very slowly. I'm adding just a little bit of brown slowly to each layer in order to create these soft shadows and keep everything very light because I want it to look kind of white. But as with any time that you're drawing or painting white, it's usually not actually white. So I still want to read white, so we're just going slowly. I do eventually use white as a highlight just to get our highest key elements in there so that everything is popping and looking nice and shiny and glossy before we then go in with our blue. And I'm going in with the ultramarine blue, and I'm not following a specific pattern. I really want this to be very light. I want to read like, again, like it might be china, but I want the focus to be on the radishes. So I don't want to take away from that by adding too much detail here. So I'm not pressing hard, I'm working very soft, and then I'm using the white to kind of add some of that sparkle, some of those highlights back in, and to be what adds my dimension. Smoothing it out with my fingers still. Again, we're keeping everything nice and soft. And I'm not moving fast through this process. I'm applying a little bit of color, pausing, stepping back, and just making sure that it's reading well. Sometimes I'll even get up and walk away from my paper in order to look at it from across the room. And it just gives me a little bit more perspective and just a little bit more of a realistic view of how everything is reading for my viewer. Now to polish everything off and give it just a little bit more dimension, I deepened the shadows and added some reflective color. So I added some red to our bowl and a little bit of green to some of the shadow areas in order to give it a little bit more harmony. Then it was time to remove the tape and call this piece done. I hope that you enjoyed this beginner-friendly oil pastel tutorial. If you'd like to see more tutorials like this in the future, please let me know in the comments section down below, and don't forget to subscribe on your way there. I will also have my full oil pastel playlist where we learn how to use oil pastels together because I am still in my first couple of months of using oil pastels and I can't wait to share with you what else I have learned. So I'll leave that playlist in the comments section down below or in the description. And until next time, happy drawing.